Good afternoon, and welcome to this halftime talk on winning strategies for financing the SDGs. As Secretary General Antonio Guterres said at the G20, today's challenges stretch as far as the eye can see. He said poverty, hunger, and inequalities are growing, but global solidarity, it's missing in action. And that's why there's urgency in the discussion we're having today, all of us here together. We need to seize this moment to build momentum for realistic strategies that are designed to win for everyone, everywhere. You saw the sign up there, win-win. We need solutions that are equitable and just. We will hear today from world leaders and leaders from development banks, the private sector, foundations, civil society, who will explore strategies for tackling debt, the cost of capital, tax, integrating civil society, special drawing rights, and as we work to position the SDGs and financing as a vehicle to achieve the goals. Please allow me to introduce our first speaker. She is someone who really does need no introduction because she is at the forefront of SDG financing and calls for the institutional transformation that is fit for purpose and designed for everyone. And she is a steadfast champion of the SDGs, our co-chair of the SDG Advocates, Her Excellency Prime Minister Mia Mottley, in a fireside chat with Fali Ba, principal presenter at Al Jazeera. Welcome, Prime Minister. And welcome, Fali.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister Mottley. Thank you. It's an honor to be speaking to you in this unique place at the UN as we engage in these frank and insightful conversations about how to mobilize the world to keep the promise of the Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you so much
for
taking
me again.
the time of your busy schedule to be here with us today. Now, Prime Minister, the G20 recently welcomed the SDG stimulus and agreed to build progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. How do we implement that, though? What should happen next?
Look, I said in Paris, and I'm not going to change from what I said, what the world needs now is scale and speed, both for people and planet. We highlight planet as if it were not part of the SDGs, but we do it largely because of the nature of the existential crisis. And if we're going to get scale and speed, then we need to be far more creative in what we do. There's not going to be any single silver bullet to it. And therefore, a tripling of multilateral development bank lending we continue to call for, the capacity to be able to use guarantees so as to unlock far more. And under European accounting rules, guarantees do not count as part and parcel of the debt. Similarly, if we were to be able to create a climate mitigation trust that is anchored both in the IMF and the World Bank, then it allows us to use the special drawing rights without it becoming a liability on the balance sheet of individual countries. Now, for some countries who are exceedingly liquid because they have sovereign wealth funds and they may want to do things on their own, they may be prepared to make that commitment by themselves. For other countries, there may be a little fiscal tightness coming out of the crisis moment that we're in, particularly with the pandemic. They may prefer special drawing rights. We need to give a menu of options in order to be able to have the collective total be at a scale that allows us to win this battle.
Right.
But I fear, as I said yesterday morning, there's a dog at our heels. We're not running fast enough, even though we're making progress. But progress is not accomplishment.
Right.
Progress is not mission accomplished. And therefore, these things need to be taken into consideration.
Sure.
There's no lack of ideas.
Of course. You mentioned debt, and I do want to come back to that in a second, but I just wanted to get your impressions first. You know, being here at the UN during UN Week, obviously the talk now is reforming the global financial institutions, right? That's the big talk. We need that to achieve these Sustainable Development Goals. But do you feel that the will is there when you meet leaders from the global north, from international financial institutions? Do you feel that they feel that we're in this all together?
I think they may feel that we're in this all together. It's just that they feel they're at the front of the ship and the rest at the back will fight on their own. And that's the problem. But regrettably, it is one ship, it is one planet. And if you ask me about the will, let's get this phrase, reform of international financial architecture, can mean so many things to so many different people. And the one thing that I've learned is ambiguity is the ally of those who want to defend the status quo. So the first thing we need to do is to get specific. As we look at reform, we don't only need to look at the things that will cause us to fight the greatest battles. In other words, the reform of the governance structure, the imbalance in power that clearly was settled in 1945, because as you heard this morning, yet again from the SG, that the majority of us were not even countries at that point in time. But there are some things that can be done. And we make the point that we need long-term money. If I'm building a school, to ask me to repay for that school in 15 years is criminal, because I don't have enough time to be able to get the proper rate of return. But if I have 30 or 40-year money, at least I know that the kids who have been educated, who've come out, they've gotten through university, they've gotten their jobs, they're now adding to the productive the production of value in the country that gives us the best chance of repaying that loan. And that's why we say that education gives us one of the greatest returns on investment. So we don't need to wait for monumental reform to be able to say, let us start giving 30 and 40-year money. Part of it requires, I suspect, a conversation with the credit rating agencies and the markets, because we've become accustomed, we've been cemented into a position that looks more at short-term liquidity rather than long-term development funds.
Right.
And that's the paradigm shift that's needed more than anything else. Now, who can make that happen? We probably are going to need a joint approach from the IMF, from the World Bank, from the UN, because the collective voices is becoming a little tiring sitting in rooms and saying these things and doing these things, and yet the power to convene and the power to have conversation is immediately available with us, because we can't be talking about people rather than talking with them.
And there's been a lot of talking. You know, there's been no progress at the G20 or any other summit on debt distress. Now, the Secretary General has proposed a debt workout mechanism with creditors and debtors around solutions without setting up necessarily a new institution in the short term. Do you see this working, and how?
But let's put it this way. I actually go further. I think we are at a jubilee moment again, and that there needs to be a debt write-off for low-income countries. You cannot go through what everybody agrees is the worst set of circumstances in the last 80 years, and we don't recognize its impact on countries. Credit rating agencies have, understandably, as far as they're concerned, not countries, taken positions where they feel they're defending the rights of people who rely on their judgment to determine whether a country is worthwhile and to what extent they can risk their money. By the same token, that credit rating agency may cause a country like Ghana to be able to go into debt distress because of the downgrades. So we really need, I believe, to, before getting to the issue of how do you change the power structure, to settle some things that are low-hanging fruit. And 30, 40-year money coming out of money spent on a pandemic, coming out of the need to be able to ensure that our children, and let me share something with you. The reality is that how many of us in this room would have succeeded if we lost 3 years of schooling? If we had an interruption of 3 years of schooling? Most of our kids are suffering as a result of that disruption.
Absolutely.
In order to intervene again, it's going to mean that we've had to take corrective measures, which means more fiscal space is needed for those. I don't get the sense that we are prepared to make that call and to understand that low-income countries at this point in time need the breathing space. And I'm not talking about middle-income countries like Barbados. We will work out our debt as we did before, and other middle-income countries should. But I do feel that not only should we support that workout from this SG,
Right.
but we should go further and have a complete debt write-off for those low-income countries that truly cannot get off of their feet. We hear again this morning that Africa spends more in debt service than it spends on health care. How can that even be conscionable in today's world?
Unconscionable. It's
unconscionable.
a complete debt write-off, you say.
I say for low-income countries, not
Right.
for middle income. I'm not being unreasonable. I believe that low-income countries, and put it in perspective, when the pandemic broke, the G7 countries went into trillions of dollars of quantitative easing. What was left for 80 countries was a debt service suspension initiative of $80 billion. That I don't think even all of it was spent as a result of the complicated nature of how it was set up. So I really do believe that we need to stop. You know, in Trinidad, there's a saying, making as if. We need to stop making as if we are doing something substantive and recognize that all we've done is to ensure that more countries are on debt row, more countries are incapable of finding the fiscal space necessary to make these SDGs, which is the development right of every human being born on this earth. That's all the SDGs are.
Right, and you mentioned the credit rating agencies, of course, that's one aspect.
They haven't been brought to the table yet.
Right.
And that, to my mind, is the big missing part of the equation, because you literally are going to have a paradigm shift moving away back to long-term money as opposed to only short-term liquidity.
The international financial institutions, big banks, World Bank, IMF, how do we make sure that the voices of vulnerable countries, these countries that are drowning in debt, are heard in these IFIs?
Let me be clear. You asked me about political will. I don't think there's anybody in the senior management, and certainly not in the leadership of these IFIs, that don't recognize the need for reform. They do, and that things can't remain the same. Why isn't it happening? It's happening because the countries that constitute the board of management, the governors, however which way they're styled, are not sending the message from capital. So the countries come to things and they say the right things, and then the board does something that's not in sync with what the countries are doing. And that really is at the core of the problem. The question is, how long can we keep the game playing? And the truth is, that's why I say the dog is running after us at a faster speed than we're moving forward. And what bothers me, and we see it with the climate crisis, that the things that get the headlines are the hurricanes, the floods. But what happens when droughts persist, not at the scale in Kenya, but at the scale to decimate the living or the opportunity for a living for so many of our people? In my own country, the first 6 months of this year, our rainfall was 50% of the 30-year average. Now, nobody's going to score that as a point, but fiscally, I'm paying the price for it, because I've got to find the money to offset the fact that those farmers did not get access to water because the rain just didn't fall, and that we now have to cart water to at least try and give them minimal support. But minimal support may mean low yields. Low yields may mean losses for them as a farmer. So these are the things that run under the level of the publicity and the news stories, but that are literally destroying communities and families, and by extension, causing grave difficulty to countries.
You certainly represent a lot of the frontline countries when it comes to this climate crisis, and your strong voice, you've spoken a lot about this, has been instrumental to set up the Loss and Damage Fund at COP27. COP28 is coming up in Dubai in a few months, less than 2 months in fact. How do we make that fund operational? What needs to happen between COP27 and COP28, which is just around the corner?
The same answer I gave you with respect to the SDGs, political will. I'm deeply concerned that the populations across the world are losing trust losing confidence in the system. And that's why I've always said, coming out of Sharm el-Sheikh, that we need to go to Dubai with a record and not a promise. People need to know that there has been appreciable progress on this particular issue. I feel, and I've said it over and over, that we have to have conversations with the oil and gas companies, with the financial institutions, with the insurance companies, with the transport companies. And as I've said again, if they don't have a plan to live on another planet, then there really has to be a recognition that something needs to be left on the table. I'm told that the profits last year in the oil and gas sector were $2.5 trillion. Now, in any other manner, form, or fashion domestically, that would be the subject of some kind of windfall tax, because the poor and the middle income have effectively paid the price. My country, I've capped, I've had to cap taxes from oil and gas at $80 per barrel, the equivalent price for $80 a barrel. If not, the consequences of inflation on individual households in Barbados will be too much. So that lack of fiscal space immediately is upon me. The money that I should be using to build coastal defenses, I'm using to be able to make sure that people don't fall through the cracks. Now, what happens then? We have a situation where oil and gas companies are therefore making, and financial institutions, because we talk about oil and gas, but we forget that the financial institutions, the insurance companies, and the transport companies are who give all of these other companies their breath and their capacity to function. I don't have anything against them, because we need them. But what we don't need is them making egregious profits. And what we don't need is them walking away from the obligations at a time when others are disproportionately suffering. So what's the deal? If you made $100 billion, $100 billion in profit, and somebody said to you, look, my gentleman, leave 10 or 15% on the table, 10 or 15 billion. What are you walking away with? 85 billion? 85 against 10 or 15, just for the right to be able to live on this planet? And that's the kind of conversations that I think we need to be having at this point in time if we are to get to Dubai with a success. West Africa has seen a number of coups.
Indeed.
Is it by accident that the northern part of most of those countries in West Africa are as brown on the map as it is possible to be, and not green as other areas? Is it by accident that the level of instability there is greatest because of the impact of climate and the impact of lack of economic activity and the lack of education? Let's get real. And they're not immune, because we talk about these things as if the people in the United States of America, the United Kingdom, or other countries in the North Atlantic are immune from political instability. Well, we've learned otherwise in the last year and a half. And the populations of those countries are soon going to start to ask questions as to why is there this inequity? Why is there this unfairness? And I'm saying to you that when we look around the world, the major omission is a handful of countries. The majority of the 193 countries of the world agree that there's now urgent time for change. Why isn't it happening? 20
Time for
countries or less?
change. Are you optimistic, though? Are you hopeful that we could
I'm
see-
persistent. And I'm persistent because we have no choice. Unless you're going to commit suicide, you have to continue to press ahead. And let us be real. History is replete with circumstances where institutions that appeared all-powerful and where the absence of leadership and the absence of political will would have suggested that all these battles would have been unsuccessful. If people did not continue to fight against slavery, we would still have it. If people did not, in our time, continue to fight against apartheid, we would still have it. So that I don't believe that institutions that are man-made are always going to maintain the position of dominance, because so long as there is sufficient solidarity and there is an encircling, then I think that people will begin to change. Look, 5 years ago, if you mentioned, as I did in 2018 and 2019 in my addresses to the General Assembly, reform of the international financial institutions, people looked at me, what are you talking about? And didn't. But we persisted and we persisted and we persisted. And why? Because in persisting, we then realized, oh, you have the same problem, and you have the same problem, and you have the same problem. And all of a sudden, that good old-time word solidarity comes back into play. And I keep saying that let us be careful that this instability that we're seeing in the South does not anchor itself in the global North. And the reality is, what is the source of migration? What is the source of terrorism? What is the source of all of the other things that we want to fight against? What is the source of vulnerability to pandemics where countries may not be able to maintain strong health systems, but then all of us become subject to it? So I don't want to bore anybody anymore, but by the same token, I do not believe that we have the luxury of walking away from the battle. And I do not believe that we should allow those who want to keep it vague, keep it ambiguous, to defend the status quo. I don't believe we should allow them to have their way. And I think that this needs to become a global movement, a global campaign, where people, nobody was talking reparations in a serious way before George Floyd. And now all of a sudden, because of the power of that, the mood changed globally and governments started to change. Look at what Greta Thunberg did with the climate crisis in terms of literally ramping up the pressure on governments, because constituents in individual constituencies started to say to people, this climate crisis is real. You can't say it's not real anymore. What are you talking about? I think that a year ago there was a president of the World Bank who felt it wasn't real either. I'm not sure where he is now.
Prime Minister Motley, thank you. Thank you so much. Persistence, solidarity. The Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Motley, thank you so much for inspiring passion and action for change. Thank you so much, Prime Minister. Thank you.